können glücklich sein zu wissen, dass diese Zukunft restlos uns gehört.
Adolf Hitler had never disguised his belief that the Soviet Union would be his regime's ultimate enemy.
Der sich als Träger seines besten Blutes fühlen und dieses wissend zur Führung der Nation.
He hated communism and saw the vast open spaces and abundant natural resources of Soviet Russia as the prize which would finally enable the German people to become the master race. Throughout the early months of 1941, as he stayed at the Berghof, his country retreat in the Bavarian Alps, Hitler planned his greatest gamble. Operation Barbarossa, the assault on the Soviet Union. Steadily, his armies were redeployed to the east and re-equipped for what would be their greatest challenge. In theory, Stalin's Soviet Union was still Hitler's ally, and Stalin was keen to keep it that way, for his country was woefully unprepared for war. The mighty Red Army, once the largest and most technologically advanced in the world, had been devastated by Stalin's purges in the late 1930s. Some 3/4 of its senior officers had been shot or imprisoned. Despite appearances, there had been a catastrophic collapse in morale and efficiency. As German soldiers now flooded into neighboring Poland, Stalin, desperate to maintain the peace, gave orders that nothing should be done to offend Hitler. But Hitler had one other task to perform before he could push on to Russia. He needed to secure his southern flank. Romania, Bulgaria, and Hungary were Germany's firm allies. But in March 1941, the Yugoslav government, sympathetic to Germany, was overthrown by pro-British forces. Its next-door neighbor, Greece, was also pro-British. So, on April the 6th, 1941, the German army invaded the Balkans. "33 German divisions moved into Yugoslavia. They swiftly tore its defenses apart. The capital, Belgrade, surrendered on April the 12th. Greece fell almost as quickly. Despite British help, Athens was captured in less than 3 weeks. The way was now clear for Operation Barbarossa. Over 4 million men were to be deployed. They were supported by more than 3,000 aircraft. The plan called for 3 simultaneous thrusts. Army Group North would overrun the Baltic states and seize Leningrad. Army Group Center was to advance to Moscow. And Army Group South would occupy the Ukraine. Hitler's generals went silent when he showed them the plan. They were worried it was too ambitious and would spread their forces too thinly. But none dared voice their doubts. The Red Army was much bigger. It had nearly 2 million men within striking distance of the Western Front and millions more in reserve. The Russians also had more than 20,000 tanks, far outnumbering Germany's 6,000. They were older and less powerful, but they were still a formidable fighting force. The issue for Germany was, could its superior technology and speed overwhelm the Russians before the Red Army's vast numbers ground them down? Operation Barbarossa began at 3:15 a.m. on June the 22nd, 1941. The Luftwaffe joined in at dawn, targeting Soviet airfields. Simultaneously, the ground attack began. The Germans swiftly crossed the River Bug on the border between Poland and the Soviet Union. Hitler's panzers were soon thrusting deep into Soviet territory. Within 2 days, the panzers had penetrated more than 50 miles. Ill-coordinated Red Army counterattacks were swiftly brushed aside. Tens of thousands of Soviet prisoners were rounded up. Meanwhile, the Luftwaffe had total domination of the air. The Red Army's leadership seemed paralyzed by the German onrush. On June the 29th, 7 days after the start of the assault, 2 panzer thrusts met up near Minsk, surrounding huge pockets of Soviet troops. As the follow-up infantry arrived, more than 300,000 prisoners were taken. Often the Germans found themselves welcomed as liberators, particularly in the Ukraine, where anti-Russian feeling was widespread. In Moscow, Stalin appeared to have suffered a near breakdown at the news of his betrayal by Hitler. He remained silent for more than a week. Not until July the 3rd did he appeal to his people's patriotism to save the motherland. In Britain, the Prime Minister, Winston Churchill, received the news of Operation Barbarossa with very different feelings. It meant the country no longer stood alone. He announced that any enemy of Nazi Germany was a friend of Britain's, no matter what the political differences in the past. He then sent a mission to Moscow to sign a treaty of mutual assistance with Soviet Foreign Minister Vyacheslav Molotov. But apart from sending aid by sea, there was little Britain could do immediately to help the Soviet Union. As June turned to July, the German blitzkrieg slashed deeper into Soviet territory. It was beginning to look as if nothing could stop Hitler, but he was about to make his first major strategic blunder. In early July 1941, over 300,000 Red Army troops were surrounded west of Minsk. Hitler's panzer commanders, in particular General Heinz Guderian, begged to be allowed to race on. Operation Barbarossa was working like clockwork. Within a week, the panzers were at Smolensk, deep inside Russia and only a couple of hundred miles from Moscow. On July the 22nd, a panzer pincer movement met to the east of Smolensk, trapping another 310,000 Soviet troops. Here there was a brief pause, while the rest of the army caught up. Though the tanks could move at spectacular speed, most of the army still had to walk or rely on horse-drawn transport. But it still only took them 5 days before they arrived and began mopping up. The operation was completed in just 9 more days. Vast columns of Soviet prisoners began trudging west to captivity. Over 2.5 million never returned. Moscow was now only 200 miles away, and the road lay open. It seemed certain it would fall by the end of the summer, as planned. But elsewhere, the German advance was finding the going more difficult. The Red Army was counterattacking more effectively, and by mid-July, Army Group South was still more than 50 miles from Kiev. Hitler decided Guderian's panzers should delay their advance on Moscow and swing south to Kiev to provide help. Guderian objected strongly, but Hitler was adamant. There should be no further advance on Moscow until Kiev had fallen. It would turn out to be a fateful decision. There were already worrying signs the Red Army was not going to be the pushover Hitler had been expecting. Soviet manpower seemed endless. More than 16 million troops were now mobilized. And the Red Army now had some formidable new weapons. In particular, a new tank, the 37-ton T-34. It had a 76mm gun and was faster and better cross-country than the Panzer Mark IV. Yet, as the blitzkrieg continued, it was easy to miss the warning signs. Guderian's panzer group began its thrust south on August the 23rd, 1941. The panzers of Army Group South struck north 3 weeks later. The pincers met east of Kiev on September the 16th. Two more Soviet armies were utterly destroyed. 500,000 men were killed or captured. On the same day, more than 1,000 miles to the north, Army Group North surrounded the city of Leningrad, today's St. Petersburg. It was immediately cut off from the rest of the Soviet Union. The city was besieged. Hitler decided not to storm it, and the German troops settled down to starve it into surrender. Conditions in the city became dire. The only link to the rest of the Soviet Union was across Lake Ladoga to the east, but only a small amount of food could come in by water. Starvation set in. Over 11,000 people died in November. Not until December could an ice road be opened across the lake, and there was a slight increase in rations. But 3,700 people died of starvation on one day in December alone. Meanwhile, Army Group Center now prepared for the final assault on Moscow. Guderian's panzers had rejoined it to lead the blitzkrieg. The Germans had a 2-to-1 superiority in tanks and men at the front, and 3-to-1 in aircraft. The assault started on September the 20th, 1941. Once again, Guderian's panzers slashed deep through the Red Army. By October the 7th, yet more Soviet troops were surrounded. But Stalin was determined to defend Moscow to the last. He appointed Marshal Georgy Zhukov to organize the defense of the city. The people of Moscow were mobilized to dig a series of defensive lines. But the real obstacle to German advance would be the weather. On October the 8th, heavy rains set in. German vehicles soon became bogged down in a sea of mud. By late October, appalling weather and an increasingly stubborn Soviet resistance meant Army Group Center was still some 50 miles short of Moscow. Hitler was finally paying the price for his decision earlier in the year to delay his advance on Moscow. At around the same time, Army Group South reached the Black Sea, trapping yet more Soviet soldiers. Another 100,000 prisoners were taken. But they too were hampered by the weather. Even so, the city of Kharkov was captured on October the 24th, 1941. But the weather was now starting to freeze. The German forces, confident the campaign would be over by the summer, were caught unprepared. With no winter clothing, they now suffered terribly. On the Moscow front, Army Group Center was now beginning its final push to capture the Soviet capital. By December the 4th, its leading units were just 19 miles from Red Square. Some reconnaissance patrols claimed they could see the golden domes of the Kremlin glinting in the distance. But that night, the temperature plunged again. Tank engines would not start. Weapons froze. Many soldiers were severely frostbitten. On December the 5th, the Germans halted the attack. Winter had come to the rescue of the Red Army. But the Germans were confident that come the spring, they could finish the job. For much of autumn 1941, Stalin's armies reeled under the German onslaught. But all the while, he had another worry, that the Japanese would attack his forces in Siberia. But in November, the Soviet dictator received a message from his top spy in Japan, assuring him the Japanese had no such intention. Immediately, more than 30 divisions began moving west along the Trans-Siberian Railway to Moscow. They were well equipped and well trained in winter fighting. By early December, more than 500,000 extra men were in position near the capital. On December the 5th, just as the Germans were abandoning their attempt to capture Moscow, they were hit by a savage Russian attack. First came a massive Soviet artillery barrage. Then swarms of Soviet T-34s crashed through the German defenses. Stunned by the savagery of the attack by an enemy they had assumed was on the ropes, the Germans fell back. For the next 7 days, the Soviet troops tore into the German forces. For Hitler, who had only reluctantly agreed to halt the attack on Moscow, it was a terrible blow. On December the 19th, he sacked his overall commander-in-chief, Field Marshal Walter von Brauchitsch, and assumed command himself. Heinz Guderian was also sacked, along with 35 other senior officers. Hitler now ordered that there would be no more retreats. The German troops should fight, and if necessary, die where they stood. It worked. The German line gradually steadied. But Stalin, elated by the Red Army's success, now demanded a massive advance across the whole front. Marshal Zhukov, one of Stalin's most trusted commanders, tried to dissuade him, but Stalin was determined. For the next 4 months, fighting swirled inconclusively around the German defensive positions. For Hitler, this was a very uncomfortable situation. He was used to and expected quick results. Now he was dangerously bogged down in the Soviet Union and facing an enemy that never seemed to give up. Nor was Russia his only headache. On December the 7th, 1941, Germany's ally Japan attacked the United States without warning. Hitler, with almost no thought, also declared war on the US. With no advanced planning, he had taken on a massive new enemy. As 1941 became 1942, Hitler remained determined to go on the offensive again in Russia. But he needed a new strategy. The original plan of fighting across the whole front was no longer tenable. Moreover, as his economic advisors told him, Germany's oil supplies were running low. So he decided to halt the attacks in the north and instead head for Russia's oil fields in the south. The initial plan for Operation Blue, as it was called, envisaged an assault south of Kharkov with Army Group A swinging down to seize the oil fields, while Army Group B covered its flank along the River Don. Straight away, there was a brutal encounter with Soviet forces trying to retake Kharkov. Another 200,000 Soviet troops were captured. 70,000 were killed. As part of the same operation, the Germans tightened their siege of the port of Sebastopol in the Crimea. For 8 months, the defenders had been under constant bombardment from German artillery, including a massive 400mm railway gun. In late June 1942, Sebastopol finally fell to the Germans. It was now safe to head for the oil fields. On June the 28th, the offensive began. Army Group B forced its way through to the River Don and advanced along its western bank. Army Group A faced stronger resistance. But by July the 9th, it was close to Rostov. Hitler now made a series of what would turn out to be serious strategic blunders. As Army Group B made its way along the Don, the Führer ordered it to capture Stalingrad, even though the city had no immediate strategic significance. The army had suddenly been given a massive new task. 2 weeks later, Hitler compounded his misjudgment. Frustrated by the slow progress of the campaign in the Caucasus, he diverted the bulk of his panzers down to the mountains. The march on Stalingrad slowed noticeably. The reinforced Army Group A now raced across the Caucasus to within 70 miles of the Caspian, threatening to cut off all the Soviet armies in the area. But then Hitler changed his mind again. Enraged by Army Group B's slow progress to Stalingrad, he now ordered the panzers back up north. On August the 9th, Army Group A seized the first of the southern oil fields at Maikop. It found them comprehensively trashed. But without reinforcements, it could get no further, and the huge oil fields in the central Caucasus and those near the Caspian Sea remained beyond its grasp. But by now, Hitler's attention had shifted again. In late August, German forces were within striking distance of Stalingrad. The assault on the city, which bore the name of Hitler's arch-enemy, had begun. It would be one of the most crucial battles of World War II. On August the 17th, 1942, General Friedrich Paulus's Sixth Army crossed the Don and began a final push on Stalingrad. Six days later, one panzer thrust had reached the Volga River just north of the city, and German forces were fighting in the outer suburbs. Hitler seemed poised for a famous victory. Stalingrad was an important industrial center. It straggled for more than 12 miles along the west bank of the river. Its factories produced over a quarter of the Soviet Union's tractors and trucks, as well as tanks and guns. The Russian people had turned it into a formidable fortress. They had been helped by Hitler's decision to send Army Group B's panzers to the south. This had given them another 2 weeks to prepare. The German plan was to make a direct assault on the city. Now began one of the most prolonged and intense battles of World War II. Slowly, the Germans edged forward, street by street, with Stuka dive bombers blitzing just ahead of them. The fighting was savage, house to house, room by room. The Soviet defenders used the sewers for shelter and communications, and the ruins above for sniping. Russian reinforcements had to be brought across the river. Often they were under assault from the air. But even so, thousands got through. By late September, the Germans had pushed their way through most of the city, almost to the Volga. For Hitler, the capture of Stalingrad was now an obsession. On October the 4th, 1942, General Paulus launched what was meant to be the final assault on Stalingrad. Tanks led the way, grinding over the rubble and firing point blank into courtyards. One German officer said, "The advance is measured in corpses, not meters." German victory seemed certain, but in fact, the Germans were dangerously overextended. By mid-November, the Soviet army was bringing in reinforcements. More than 1 million troops, 13,500 guns, 900 tanks, and over 1,000 aircraft were secretly moved to the battle zone. On November the 19th, they attacked the Germans' northern flank. After a massive artillery barrage, the T-34s and assault infantry burst through the German positions. Now it was the Germans who surrendered in their thousands. The next day, a Soviet assault in the south was equally successful. And on November the 23rd, these pincer movements met west of Stalingrad, cutting off the German 6th Army. General Paulus, in charge of the German forces, could have broken out, but Hitler ordered him to stand and fight. The Führer had been assured by the Luftwaffe that sufficient supplies could be airlifted into Stalingrad. This was enough for him to announce that the German positions must hold out until relieved. To help Paulus, Field Marshal Erich von Manstein, the overall German commander in the region, launched Operation Winter Storm on December the 12th. It was an attempt by the German panzers to break the Soviet encirclement of the city. For 2 days it went well, but then Red Army resistance increased. By December the 23rd, the German rescue attempt had ground to a halt about 30 miles from the city. Manstein advised the beleaguered Paulus to attempt to break out of Stalingrad. But Paulus wanted Hitler's permission. This was refused. It was probably too late anyway. Marshal Zhukov now unleashed the next stage of his master plan. It was a massive assault on the Panzer Relief Operation. The panzers were pushed back, away from the city, and by the end of December, all hope of relieving the German forces in Stalingrad had gone. Worse still, plans to airlift aid into the city were a fiasco. The German troops needed 700 tons of supplies a day to survive. They never received more than 80. The weather was too bad, and the Red Air Force now commanded the skies. Steadily, the Soviet troops squeezed in on the encircled Germans. 200,000 men were trapped. On January the 8th, the Soviets called on the Germans to surrender. They refused. On January the 31st, 1943, Paulus was forced to surrender. Over 100,000 men stumbled off into captivity. Only 5,000 would ever return to Germany. Stalingrad had been a bloody battle. The Germans had been savaged. They had lost some 300,000 of their men and at least as many of their allies. The Russians had lost about the same number, including thousands of civilians. It was Germany's greatest catastrophe in the war so far, but it wouldn't be the last. The Red Army was now inflicting massive defeats on Hitler's forces across the whole Eastern Front. Stalingrad had been a great triumph for the Soviet army. Now its operational commander, Marshal Zhukov, set his sights on Germany's Army Group A, still camped in the Caucasus. Soviet troops thrust their way west of Stalingrad, and by early December 1942 were within 120 miles of Rostov. There was a real possibility all the German forces in the south would be cut off. With little choice, Hitler reluctantly gave Army Group A permission to fall back. Over the next month, the Germans fought a skillful rearguard action. Hundreds of thousands of troops withdrew. Then, on January the 12th, 1943, Zhukov launched an all-out assault. The Soviets attacked along a 500-mile front. Outnumbered 7-1, von Manstein, the overall commander of German forces in the region, fought a brilliant mobile retreat. But by the end of February, the Red Army had recaptured both Kursk and the nearby city of Kharkov. This Russian winter offensive had struck a crippling blow to German power. Over a matter of months, it had lost 1 million men and vast numbers of tanks and guns. The Red Army still had enormous reserves of manpower. It was also benefiting from a huge increase in weapons production and aid from the United States and Britain. The Germans also no longer had the technological upper hand. The T-34 tank was more than a match for the Panzer Mark IV. And they also had the terrifying Katyusha multiple rocket system, which shattered German troops. Yet Hitler refused to give up hope. He still dreamed of a preemptive summer assault that would throw the Soviet Union off balance and regain the initiative. The city of Kursk seemed the obvious place to start. Here, the Soviet assault had pushed a bulge deep into the German lines. It looked temptingly exposed. Hitler decided it should be cut off and annihilated. He also had an ace up his sleeve. The German counterattack would be led by a new generation of German tanks, specially designed to combat the formidable Russian T-34. The massive but slow 55-ton Tiger had a lethal 88mm gun, and its frontal armor made it almost impervious to Soviet tank darts. And then there was the faster 43-ton Panther with a new 75mm gun, also capable of knocking out the T-34. These tanks were so new, Hitler was forced to delay the attack whilst sufficient numbers were manufactured and delivered to the front. But even as the German forces began to assemble, the Soviet commander, Marshal Zhukov, guessed what was about to happen. Soon afterwards, he received information from a Soviet spy ring inside the German High Command, confirming the site of the attack. Zhukov ordered the construction of a series of defensive lines with anti-tank ditches, minefields, and deep belts of barbed wire. He also massively built up Soviet forces in the area, pulling in troops and tanks from less vulnerable parts of the front. By the eve of the assault on Kursk, the Germans were hugely outnumbered by Soviet defenders, who also knew exactly when the Germans would attack. On July the 5th, 1943, just as the German troops prepared to assault, they were hit by a huge Soviet artillery bombardment. Even so, the next morning, the panzers still rolled forward. But this time, they were up against a well-entrenched enemy. There was no realistic chance of a lightning blitzkrieg breakthrough. The results were disastrous. In the north, the German army gained a mere 6 miles for the loss of 25,000 men and more than 200 tanks. In the south, the Germans fared a little better. A wedge 25 miles deep was driven into the Soviet defenses, but it also came at a high price. 10,000 men were killed and 350 tanks destroyed. But for a brief moment, it looked as if a German breakthrough might be possible. Then Zhukov threw in his reserves. On July the 12th, 1943, 900 tanks charged into the German flank. Almost 2,000 tanks now engaged in what was the largest armored battle of World War II. The Soviet T-34s drove into the German lines and opened fire at point-blank range. After a single day of brutal combat, the Germans had lost a further 350 tanks and were retreating. Meanwhile, overhead, there was an epic air battle. Eventually, the Soviet Air Force established supremacy over the Luftwaffe. Now the Russians could unleash their formidable Ilyushin IL-2 Stormovik tank killers. By July the 23rd, the Germans had lost any ground they had gained, and with it, the cream of their army. Hitler's adventure at Kursk had cost him at least 50,000 troops and more than 700 tanks. Never again would the Germans launch a major offensive on the Eastern Front. The Russians had turned the tide of the war. At 7:56 on the morning of December the 7th, 1941, Japanese aircraft swooped down over Hawaii. Their target? The US Pacific Fleet at anchor in its base at Pearl Harbor. Five US ships were hit immediately. A few minutes later, more Japanese aircraft joined in. By 8:35, 2 US battleships were sinking, 2 had capsized, and 2 were badly damaged. A 7th battleship, the Nevada, slipped her moorings and was heading out to sea when she too was caught and forced to beach. Simultaneously, Japanese Zero fighters strafed US aircraft lined up on the island's airstrips. They also shot up nearby army barracks. By the end of the attack, dozens of US warships had been sunk or damaged. 188 aircraft were also destroyed. The next day, US President Franklin Roosevelt declared war on Japan.
Since the unprovoked and dastardly attack by Japan on Sunday, December 7th, 1941, a state of war has existed between the United States and the Japanese Empire.
The stage was set. Could Japan knock out the United States with a swift blow before the huge might of America ground it down? It would become one of the great conflicts of World War II. Japan's first steps towards war had come in August 1940. Capitalizing on France's defeat in Europe, it seized control of air bases in the north of the French colony of Indochina. It was looking for a quick and easy expansion of its empire. A year later, it issued an ultimatum demanding the use of all French air bases throughout Indochina. When the French hesitated, the Japanese invaded and seized control of the entire colony. Japan felt the consequences almost immediately. The United States froze its overseas financial assets, effectively robbing the country of its ability to buy oil. Japan faced a choice: climb down and lose face, or seize more territory and up the stakes. For a new Japanese government, under the aggressive General Hideki Tojo, there was no question about which course to take. Japanese army and navy commanders were told to prepare for a swift war to occupy all the far eastern territories controlled by Britain, France, the Netherlands, and the United States. The country was expecting a swift victory. Japan saw the Americans, in particular, as a nation of pleasure lovers with no stomach for a lengthy war and heavy casualties. The Japanese military calculated that if they could destroy the US Pacific Fleet, the US would quickly sue for peace. It was now that they decided to attack Pearl Harbor. Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto, commander of the Japanese Combined Fleet, was put in charge. He had 10 battleships, 10 aircraft carriers, and the world's most advanced naval aircraft. Against him, the US Pacific Fleet had 8 World War I vintage battleships and 2 carriers. Yamamoto planned the attack with great care. He would hit the US fleet in Pearl Harbor on a Sunday, since, according to intelligence reports, it usually spent the weekends in port. In total radio silence, the Japanese strike force gathered in Tankan Bay in the northerly Kuril Islands. The fleet set sail on November the 26th, 1941. Meanwhile, as a decoy, Japanese negotiators arrived in Washington to discuss a possible Japanese withdrawal from China. The Japanese fleet refueled after several days at sea. 3 days later, it was off Hawaii. The Americans were still blissfully unaware that anything was wrong. At 6 a.m. on December the 7th, after a final briefing, the first wave of Japanese aircraft took off. As the Japanese aircraft dived into the attack, US personnel was still just stirring on a fine Sunday morning. It was all over in less than 2¼ hours. Yamamoto's plan had worked like a dream. Or had it? There was only one problem. The US fleet's 2 aircraft carriers had not been in Pearl Harbor at the time and had escaped the attack. Yamamoto's main aim of crippling the US Pacific Fleet had only partially succeeded. US naval air power in the region was still intact. But in the United States, there was shock and disbelief. It quickly turned into a mood of fury and determination. Angry mobs attacked the Japanese embassy. Japan had disturbed the sleeping giant. The US Secretary of the Navy, Frank Knox, spoke for many.
The Japs started this war. We are going to finish it.
Yet before the US could mobilize its full strength, the Japanese were to inflict more humiliating defeats on the Western Allies. In December 1941, as America was licking its wounds after Pearl Harbor, Japan launched a series of attacks on Western colonies in Southeast Asia. It thought it had knocked out America. Now it moved against Britain and its colonies. The first to be hit was Malaya, where a Japanese force came ashore in the northeast of the country. The plan was that it should make its way south down the east coast. The invasion force was met by a contingent of British Indian troops. But after a day of fighting, they were brushed aside. Meanwhile, further north in Thailand, a second Japanese landing was unopposed. 30,000 Japanese troops were soon making their way down the western coast of Malaya. The target of the two groups, Singapore, the center of British military and political rule in the Far East. Britain had turned the island into what it believed was an impregnable fortress. But all the guns pointed south, out to sea. The Japanese were approaching by land from the north. Yet British military commanders remained remarkably untroubled. They didn't rate the Japanese as fighting men and believed the Malay jungle was, anyway, virtually impassable. But the Japanese had other ideas. To soften up Singapore, they attacked the city from the air. Britain sent the new battleship Prince of Wales and a battlecruiser, Repulse, to attack Japanese troop convoys. They were met by Japanese bombers. Both warships were sunk in less than 2 hours. Almost 1,000 of their crew were lost. It was the greatest British naval disaster of World War II. In an era of aircraft and aircraft carriers, it was now clear the battleship, for years the mainstay of the British Navy, had had its day. Back on land, the Japanese continued to head south towards Singapore. On January the 11th, 1942, Kuala Lumpur was captured. The British forces fell back and withdrew to Singapore. There were now about 100,000 British soldiers to defend it. They faced a force of only 30,000 Japanese. Even without their big guns, the British should have been able to hold out. The Japanese launched an assault in early February. It was supported by more airstrikes. The British defense was soon reduced to chaos. Civilian casualties began to escalate. Four days later, the Japanese had pushed through the last of the British defensive lines. The commander, General Arthur Percival, surrendered with over 90,000 men. Never in the history of the British Army had a commander in charge of such a large force had to surrender, and to an enemy general whose force was outnumbered more than 3 to 1. Britain's 200-year-old power and prestige in the Far East had been wiped out in just 10 weeks. But it wasn't the only disaster. Elsewhere in Southeast Asia, the Japanese forces were equally triumphant. The British garrison in Hong Kong fought for 2 weeks before succumbing to a Japanese invasion. In the Philippines, America fared no better. Here, a preemptive bombing raid caught large numbers of US aircraft neatly lined up at Clark Field. Most were destroyed. Two days later, with US air power virtually non-existent, Japanese troops began to land. The local Philippine troops melted away. The Japanese advanced rapidly. 10 days later, Manila was captured. The US soldiers were forced to withdraw to the Bataan Peninsula. Here they hoped to hold out until a relief force could be sent. It never came. On April 3rd, 1942, Japanese troops launched a major assault on US positions. After 4 days' heavy fighting, they broke through. The Americans surrendered 2 days later. That left just one British colony in the region, Burma. In early 1942, Japanese forces pushed into the south of the country. The British defenses had been utterly neglected. There were only some 15,000 men defending the country. They were no match for the Japanese. The Allied troops mounted a brief but doomed resistance. Less than 2 months after invading Burma, the Japanese had seized the capital, Rangoon. 8 weeks later, the British had been pushed entirely out of the country. In just under 6 months, the Japanese had seized control of the whole eastern rim of the Pacific. Their Oriental blitzkrieg had been swift and crushing. Yet already, there were warning signs that they were not as powerful as they appeared. On April the 18th, 1942, 4 months after Pearl Harbor, America struck back at the Japanese. US bombers flying low over Tokyo dropped bombs on the city close to the Emperor's palace. Others struck Yokohama, Kobe, and Nagoya. The raid, authorized by President Roosevelt himself, was daring in the extreme. The B-25 Mitchell bombers had not been designed to be launched from aircraft carriers. They barely managed to lumber off the deck of the USS Hornet, which had brought them to within 700 miles of the Japanese capital. But that didn't diminish their effectiveness in the air. In Japan, the raids caused profound shock. After their runaway successes of the past 4 months, they had never expected an attack on their homeland. Japan's military planners now decided to extend the country's defenses. If they could seize additional strategic outposts in the Pacific, they could attack and destroy Allied forces before they even came close to the homeland. Japan already controlled much of the Chinese coast, Southeast Asia, and the Philippines. They had also seized the Dutch East Indies. Now they decided to strike south and attack Papua New Guinea and the Solomon Islands, and east to take the island of Midway in the middle of the Pacific. It would mean the homeland was surrounded by a string of fortified positions. Yet even as Japan was planning its move, its operations were severely compromised, though it only realized this after the war. The United States had broken its military and diplomatic codes. By spring 1942, the US Navy's code-breaking team in Hawaii was reading enough messages to give it a remarkably accurate insight into Japan's intentions. So it was that the US Commander-in-Chief in the region, Admiral Chester Nimitz, learnt the details and timing of Japan's planned invasions of the Solomon Islands and Papua New Guinea. If successful, they would cut off Australia from her allies. A Japanese bombing raid on Darwin had already caused widespread fear of an invasion. In early May 1942, the Japanese plan to widen its defensive perimeter was launched. They seized the Solomon Islands. Two days later, the Japanese carrier force entered the Coral Sea in preparation for the main assault on Papua New Guinea. But this time, the Americans had anticipated them. Admiral Nimitz had ordered 2 US aircraft carriers and a number of smaller warships into the area. For 2 days, the rival fleets searched for each other. Then, on May the 7th, US aircraft located and sank the Japanese carrier Shoho. Battle of the Coral Sea was underway. Early the following day, the Japanese responded, unleashing a hail of torpedoes and bombs. To begin with, the US aircraft carrier Yorktown managed to avoid the Japanese torpedoes. But then she took a bomb which penetrated 4 decks before exploding. 37 men were killed. The larger and less maneuverable carrier, Lexington, was also hit by several bombs as well as 2 torpedoes. She developed a heavy list to port. The Americans returned fire, attacking the Japanese carrier Shokaku. The first US raid was blunted by Japanese Zero fighters, which forced the US Douglas Devastator bombers to drop their torpedoes too far out. All the torpedoes missed. But a second wave of US dive bombers struck home. The Shokaku's deck was so badly damaged, she could no longer be used by aircraft. After 2 days of fighting, the 2 forces finally disengaged. That evening, the Lexington, still afloat, suddenly erupted in a huge explosion. There had been an undetected leak of aviation fuel that had caught fire. Amazingly, all but 215 of the nearly 3,000 men on board were rescued. Later that evening, an American torpedo scuttled the burning hulk. The Battle of the Coral Sea was, on paper, a draw. Each side had lost 1 carrier and had another severely damaged. Strategically, however, it was a major US success. It had prevented the Japanese from seizing more territory, and it had stopped them from isolating Australia. The Battle of the Coral Sea marked a new era in naval tactics. It was the first major sea battle in which the opposing ships were completely out of visual contact. It was fought, instead, by aircraft flying from carriers. It would soon become clear which side had adapted to the new form of naval conflict more successfully. By the late spring of 1942, Japan and America were deadlocked. Japan needed a quick victory if it was not to be ground down by the huge resources of the United States. In mid-May, it began its next move. US codebreakers reported Japanese plans for a new attack. It would be on Target AF, somewhere in the mid-Pacific. The problem for the Americans was that they had no idea where Target AF was. Could it be a reference to Midway Island near Hawaii? An ideal jumping-off point for another attack on the American fleet in Pearl Harbor. The code-breaking team suggested a way to find out. The US Air Base on Midway was instructed to send an uncoded message reporting problems with the island's water system. Almost immediately, the codebreakers intercepted a Japanese signal that Target AF was having water supply problems. Admiral Chester Nimitz now knew exactly where the enemy would strike. The Japanese plan was typically complex. A diversionary attack on the Aleutian Islands in the North Pacific would draw away part of the US fleet, while Midway was seized by an occupation force. The Americans would be obliged to hurriedly commit their carrier force to retaking the island. There they would be annihilated by a huge Japanese naval presence, including 4 large aircraft carriers. It was the second Japanese attempt to wipe out the US Navy in the Pacific within a year. Forewarned, the American carriers left port and moved to a position where they could ambush the Japanese. On June 3rd, 1942, Japanese forces launched the expected attack on the Aleutian Islands. Nimitz didn't respond. Then, early the next morning, the main Japanese carrier force launched a first airstrike on Midway Island to soften up its defenses. US warplanes from the island intercepted them. Most were outdated Brewster Buffaloes and were easily shot down by the more agile Japanese Zero fighters. But the Japanese attack had been blunted. Midway's defenses had not been broken. The Japanese commander, Admiral Chuiki Nagumo, faced a difficult decision. He'd kept some of his aircraft in reserve, loaded with munitions designed specifically for attacking ships, just in case the US fleet was spotted. Should he now order this reserve to be stripped of its torpedoes and armor-piercing bombs and reloaded with high-explosive and fragmentation bombs for a second strike on Midway? It would leave him ill-equipped to take on the US Navy, but he calculated it was a risk worth taking. Then, just as the reloading was underway, he received unwelcome news. A US naval force had been spotted. Was this the US carrier force or a smaller, less significant fleet of ships? Nagumo was in a dilemma. Should he continue with the second strike on Midway, or should he once again re-equip his bombers to take on the US vessels? Nagumo decided to gamble. He would push ahead with the second strike on Midway. His hope was that when the bombers returned, there would still be time to rearm them to take on the US ships. Even as he weighed the odds, the Japanese carriers were attacked by US bombers. Every available Japanese Zero fighter was scrambled before the US bombers were repelled. Then came another report from reconnaissance planes. The US force did indeed contain aircraft carriers. Nagumo was, once again, on the spot. His aircraft were halfway through reloading, but the US carriers were a much more important target. He took a second gamble. He decided to change their weapons yet again to attack the US force. But while he did so, his ships would be sitting ducks. Almost immediately, they came under attack from low-flying US torpedo bombers. But they were old and slow and attacked without fighter support. As they approached the Japanese fleet, they were rapidly shot down. For a brief period, it looked as though Nagumo's gamble had paid off. Then, just as his bombers had been reloaded and were ready to take on the US carriers, disaster struck. US dive bombers, approaching unseen at high altitude, hurtled down on his ships. The Japanese were caught completely by surprise. Nagumo had gambled once too often and was now at the mercy of American air power. Within 5 minutes, the US dive bombers had reduced 3 of Japan's largest aircraft carriers to flaming wrecks. All would later sink. A fourth carrier, the Hiryu, had been masked by a rainstorm and that afternoon mounted a desperate counterattack. The US carrier Yorktown was severely damaged. It was torpedoed by a Japanese submarine several days later. But the Japanese fight back was short-lived. Late in the afternoon that day, the Hiryu was also hit and turned into a blazing pyre. In a matter of hours, Japan's mastery of the sea had been destroyed. The attack on Midway Island had achieved nothing. But it had cost Japan its finest carriers and 332 aircraft. Well over 2,000 sailors had also died. America now ruled the waves in the Pacific. Yet Japan was still undefeated on land and a powerful, threatening force in the air. In the coming months, it would try to maximize these advantages. By summer 1942, Japanese plans to build a defensive ring of occupied territories around their homeland had still not been completed. Heavy losses at sea had frustrated their attempts to grab Papua New Guinea and islands in the Central Pacific. Japanese planners now came up with a new plan. If they couldn't do it by sea, they'd do it by land. On July the 21st, a division-sized force of experienced jungle troops landed on the northern coast of Papua New Guinea. They immediately struck west to capture Port Moresby, the capital. Progress was swift at first. The small Australian defence force was completely outnumbered. Within weeks, the Japanese had captured the main pass over the Owen Stanley Mountains. They then halted to await reinforcements before the final push on Port Moresby. The Australians also mustered new forces. When the Japanese moved off again, they now met much stiffer resistance. For the first time, Japanese troops were up against men who matched them for training, experience, and morale. The Australians stood their ground, and the Japanese were temporarily brought to a standstill. But conditions in the jungle were appalling. There was constant tropical rain. Malaria was rife. The Australians were eventually, again, forced to retreat. After 2 months of grim fighting, the Japanese were within 30 miles of Port Moresby. Then, finally, US reinforcements arrived. Through September and October, the Japanese were, in their turn, forced back. The Japanese made an heroic but suicidal stand. Many chose to die fighting rather than surrender. It took the Allies another 2 months before the Japanese were finally overwhelmed. It had been a bloodbath. "15,000 Japanese troops had embarked on the operation. Only 3,000 got away. The Japanese were in trouble. They'd lost at sea. They were now rapidly losing the initiative on land. American military might was asserting itself. There was only one alternative left: air power. Through the summer of 1942, Japanese engineers began building a string of airstrips across the Pacific. One was on the island of Guadalcanal, in the southern Solomon Islands. It was particularly well situated to threaten US convoys heading for Australia. It would become the focus of an epic battle. In July 1942, an amphibious force of US Marines invaded the island. They landed without resistance. The plan was to capture the half-built airstrip, complete it, and then turn it into a US base. But the Japanese were not ready to give up. That night, they sent in a naval force to land reinforcements and to attack the fleet of US ships supporting the Marines. In a dazzling display of night fighting, the Japanese cruisers sank 4 Allied warships and drove the rest out to sea. The Marines were now marooned, without supplies and without much of their equipment. They dug in around the airstrip. Despite constant bombardment, using construction machinery left behind by the Japanese, they pushed ahead with the completion of the airfield. Two weeks later, a group of US Wildcat fighters and dauntless dive bombers flew in. They were not a moment too soon. The next day, newly arrived Japanese troops launched a series of suicidal attacks on the airstrip. Over the following months, wave after wave of fanatical troops were thrown into the battle. By the winter of 1942, the two sides had fought themselves to a standstill, both now dug in to defensive positions. Then, in December, the exhausted US Marines were replaced by fresh troops. US soldiers now began a new push on the increasingly isolated pockets of Japanese resistance. By early February 1943, the Americans had finally won control of Guadalcanal. They had now beaten the Japanese at sea and on land. They had even denied them access to the air. The Oriental Blitzkrieg had failed. The Japanese Empire now faced a foe that was still growing in strength at a rate it could never hope to match. It was the beginning of a fundamental shift in the course of the war. As Hitler marched triumphantly across Western Europe in the early summer of 1940, his fellow dictator in Italy, Benito Mussolini, dreamt of a similar campaign further south.
Fiamma il sangue, principi che sorgono e che nascono, e I principi che declinano, la vittoria è per noi, per I primi.
His dream was to build a new Roman Empire that would see Italy expand not only along the northern Mediterranean coast, but south through North Africa. He would turn the Mediterranean into Mare Nostrum, our sea. But it was a dream that would turn into a disaster. It would lead, in due course, to Mussolini's death and fatally overextend his German ally. At the start of the war, Italy already controlled Libya and Abyssinia, Ethiopia today. Mussolini calculated that if he could take British-controlled Egypt and Sudan, he would be able to create a huge swathe of Italian-controlled territory. It looked like an easy campaign. Italy had 10 times more troops in the region than Britain. In September 1940, Mussolini invaded Egypt and captured the small coastal town of Sidi Barrani. There, the Italians stopped and dug in. Britain gathered all available forces for a counterattack. On December the 6th, 1940, they moved in across the desert. Just 4 days later, they overran the Italian defenses. Nearly 40,000 Italians were taken prisoner. It was the first sign that the Italian army was in poor fighting shape. The remainder of the defeated Italians retreated back across the Libyan border. The British followed in hot pursuit. In barely a month, the Western Desert Force, as it was called, had advanced almost 600 miles across Libya. It now paused and dug in at the Libyan coastal town of El Agheila. Almost half of Italy's Libyan empire had been seized and over 100,000 Italian troops taken prisoner. Meanwhile, to the south, British forces invaded Italian-controlled Abyssinia. The fighting lasted for nearly 12 months. The rugged terrain made communications and transport difficult. But in the end, the Italians were forced to surrender. But even as Abyssinia was being secured, Mussolini's empire building was causing problems in another part of the Mediterranean. Nearly 2 years earlier, in April 1939, as part of his plan for a new Roman Empire, Mussolini had occupied Albania. The following year, he demanded Greece become an Italian colony. When the Greeks refused, he invaded. The Greeks were outnumbered more than 2 to 1, but they swiftly turned back the Italian advance. By the beginning of March 1941, the Italians had not only been pushed out of Greece, but out of much of neighbouring Albania too. Britain's Prime Minister, Winston Churchill, promised help so the Greeks could finish the job. But Britain's forces were already heavily committed elsewhere. So it was that the British units in North Africa were told to abandon their Libyan adventure and ship much of the force across the Mediterranean to Albania. As the Italian troops were now pushed back, Mussolini's Balkan ambitions fell apart. The Italians were in deep trouble. It left Hitler with a problem. Should he divert troops from elsewhere in Europe to support his most important European ally, or should he abandon Mussolini to his fate? He decided to help. In April 1941, over 500,000 German troops swept down into Yugoslavia and Greece. For Germany, it would prove to be the beginning of a fateful entanglement with Mussolini's political dreams. But at first, all went well. The Greeks, despite British help, were unable to hold the Germans back, and in late April, the Axis forces captured the Greek capital of Athens. Some 30,000 men were evacuated to the British-controlled island of Crete. Hitler decided to flush them out. He had at his command some 22,000 parachute and glider-borne troops, backed up by 150 Stuka dive bombers. The landings began at first light on May the 20th. To begin with, they focused on the main airfields. The Allied forces were overstretched. There were incessant German air attacks. The Germans soon captured the airfields and began to fly in reinforcements. The Allies were pushed back across the island. Two weeks later, it was all over. 15,000 Allied troops had to be evacuated. A further 18,000 were taken prisoner. The Axis powers now controlled much of the Mediterranean and the critical supply routes to North Africa. It looked as though Hitler's decision to support Mussolini had paid off. He was poised to drive Britain out of the entire region. In February 1941, a junior German general arrived at the Libyan port of Tripoli. Erwin Rommel was one of the rising stars of the German army and had been chosen by Hitler as the man to rescue his Italian ally and retake North Africa for the Axis powers. The first units of his Africa Corps were soon landing. Some 16,000 men and over 100 tanks had been diverted from the European front. The Axis forces rapidly outnumbered the British troops, depleted by the war in Greece and Crete. Rommel advanced towards the British positions at El Agheila and attacked. As the British fell back, Rommel pursued them. In a matter of weeks, the Allied soldiers had been pushed all the way back to the Egyptian border. But in the retreat, a division of Australian troops had been cut off by the Germans in the Libyan port of Tobruk. The British commander, Sir Archibald Wavell, now launched 2 successive attempts to relieve them. Both were fought off by Rommel's now well-encamped troops. The Germans massively outgunned the British. Their 88mm anti-aircraft guns, when used against tanks, far outranged the British. Moreover, Rommel took advantage of the wide-open landscape to drive his tanks around the British forces, outflanking them time and time again. It would become his trademark tactic. The British press, half grudgingly, half admiringly, nicknamed Rommel the Desert Fox. For Wavell, it was too much. Now exhausted, he was replaced by General Claude Auchinleck. Auchinleck came under immediate pressure to try again to relieve the Allied troops in Tobruk. But he refused until his forces had been reinforced. Then, on November the 18th, 1941, he launched a major assault. Operation Crusader, as it was called, started with a lengthy armored dogfight. Again, the British tanks suffered heavy casualties. But the infantry slowly moved forward. Finally, after a month of confused fighting, Rommel retreated. Tobruk had been relieved. The Axis units fell back along the coast, all the way to their starting point at El Agheila. Auchinleck's military command now assumed Rommel was a spent force, at least for the time being. Its units were dispersed to bases along the coast for a badly needed refit. It was a mistake. Two months later, in January 1942, Rommel's Afrika Korps was back on the attack. It quickly brushed aside the forward units of a now unprepared British army. The chase along the coast of Africa began all over again. The Allies fell back towards a new defensive line just west of Tobruk. Here, a series of defensive positions, known as the Gazala Line, were constructed. Rommel attacked it at the end of May 1942. Once again, he swung his armour around the British forces in a great outflanking movement and came in behind the British positions. But this time the British were prepared for it and tried in turn to outflank Rommel. The fighting lasted for 3 weeks as each side tried to outmaneuver the other. Eventually, the British were forced to retreat. 3 days later, the Germans overran the Allied positions. Rommel pressed home his advantage. The British withdrawal threatened to become a rout. Finally, Auchinleck turned to face his enemy at the Egyptian village of El Alamein. His southern flank rested on the Qattara Depression, an area impassable to tanks. On July the 1st, 1942, Rommel attacked again. But this time, the British defences held. Rommel, with his supply lines stretched and now seriously short of fuel, was forced to give up. Now Auchinleck attempted a counterattack. For the rest of July, the two sides pushed at each other like exhausted boxers. Churchill was furious at the lack of British progress and now visited Egypt. It was time for yet another change of leadership. Auchinleck was replaced by not one, but two generals. General Harold Alexander as Commander-in-Chief near East, and General Bernard Montgomery as commander of 8th Army. The British and Axis forces had fought each other to a standstill. There was no clear winner, and the fate of North Africa still hung in the balance. Everything would now depend on whether the British could throttle the Axis supply routes across the Mediterranean. For the first months of World War II, the Allies had enjoyed unchallenged control of the Mediterranean Sea. Britain's oil supplies from the Middle East passed through it undisturbed, and communications with the Empire in India and the Far East were secure. Italy's entry into the war changed all that. Its naval fleet was modern and well equipped. The Italians now concentrated their fire on the strategically crucial British-controlled island of Malta. The island was an important refueling base for British submarines and aircraft in the eastern Mediterranean. It had become the center for Royal Navy attacks on Italian and German supply convoys to North Africa. In summer 1940, Italy bombed it. It was the beginning of a 2-year assault, which would inflict terrible suffering on the island's population. Yet for all Malta's strategic significance, Britain was caught on the hop. There were no fighter aircraft on the island to beat off the attacks. Then, almost by accident, 4 Gladiator fighter biplanes were found in crates on the island. They were hastily assembled. The aircraft put up a fierce resistance. For 3 weeks, the fate of Malta remained uncertain. Then, finally, British fighter reinforcements arrived, and the Italian bombers were temporarily beaten off. But it was now obvious to the British that they had to do something if they were to keep a toehold in the region. That winter, Britain launched what it hoped would be a knockout blow against the Italian Navy. On the evening of November the 11th, 21 Swordfish torpedo bombers lifted off an aircraft carrier. They swept in on the Italian fleet, anchored in its base at Taranto. The Italians hadn't expected it. Three of Italy's 6 battleships were crippled. 4 months later, Britain struck again. The Italian fleet was again caught off guard off the coast of Greece. A 4th Italian battleship was damaged. Mussolini's challenge to the British Navy was finished. It was a turning point for Hitler, too. It was now clear that Italy could no longer be depended on to maintain control of the Mediterranean. It meant his supply lines to North Africa were at risk of being cut off. Germany decided to take a direct hand. In early 1941, the Luftwaffe bombed Malta. The island took another severe battering. The attacks continued, month after month. Yet the British garrison hung on. During an interlude in the German bombardment in autumn 1941, it even managed to step up its attacks on the Axis supply convoys to North Africa. Then the Luftwaffe resumed the assault. But despite the battering, the people of Malta held on. The following spring, in April 1942, they received a unique honor for the heroism they had shown under 4 months of devastating Axis bombardment. The island was awarded the George Cross, Britain's highest award for civilian courage. But by the summer of 1942, Malta was running short of supplies and ammunition. In mid-June, the British Navy sent convoys from Gibraltar and Egypt to relieve it. But the Germans were waiting. Just 2 of the 17 ships got through. The situation on the island was getting desperate. It was time for some decisive action. In August, Britain launched Operation Pedestal, the biggest convoy ever sent to Malta. 14 merchant ships entered the Mediterranean through the Straits of Gibraltar. They were accompanied by a large naval escort. Almost immediately, they ran into German opposition. For 3 days, there was a ferocious sea battle as Axis submarines and aircraft attempted to stop and sink the convoy. Finally, on the 4th day, 5 of the British merchant ships made it into port. They brought with them just enough supplies to keep the island going. Malta had been rescued. It meant the Allies could continue to harass the Axis supply lines to North Africa. It was a strategic advantage that would prove crucial to future events in the region. In North Africa, Churchill's orders to his new team, Generals Alexander and Montgomery, were simple. Destroy the army commanded by Field Marshal Rommel. Almost immediately they were informed by the team that had broken Germany's Enigma code that Rommel was preparing to attack them. Montgomery assumed the Desert Fox would try another of his outflanking moves and fortified the ridge of Alam Halfa, just to the southeast of El Alamein. It was, he hoped, the rock on which the Axis forces would be broken. When it came, the fighting lasted for 3 days. This time, Allied ground forces were helped by air power. The RAF played havoc with the advancing German tanks. Rommel was forced to give up, and, short of fuel again, he pulled back. It was now Rommel's turn to dig in. He chose a line between the impassable sand sea of the Qattara Depression and the Mediterranean coast. Great belts of minefields were covered by artillery. Rommel's panzer divisions were held back as a mobile reserve to destroy any Allied breakthroughs. Montgomery was well aware it was a formidable barrier. He also knew it was impossible to outflank it. His only option was to punch his way directly through the middle of the Axis defenses. He was helped by a flood of new equipment from the United States, which included the new American Lee and Sherman tanks with 75mm guns. At last, the Allies had a weapon which could match the Germans. Finally, on the evening of October the 23rd, 1942, the British opened up an artillery bombardment on Rommel's positions. The Battle of El Alamein had begun. Under cover of the bombardment, Allied engineers moved forward to clear paths through the Axis minefields. British, Australian, New Zealand and South African divisions fought to drive a hole through Rommel's defences. Rommel's artillery took a terrible toll. Casualties mounted on both sides. The Axis forces were harried by Allied air power. Finally, after 10 days of fighting, the Allied forces broke through. The following day, Rommel retreated. It was Germany's first major defeat at the hands of the Western Allies. Churchill was triumphant.
This is not the end. It is not even the beginning of the end. But it is perhaps the end of the beginning.
For 2.5 months, Montgomery chased Rommel west along the North African coast towards Tunisia. Meanwhile, an Anglo-American force had landed 1,000 miles to his rear in French North Africa, Morocco and Algeria today. It was codenamed Operation Torch. The Allied First Army was soon moving eastwards towards Tunisia. Rommel was in danger of being attacked from behind. Over the next few days, the Germans flew in tens of thousands of troops from Europe to save Rommel and shore up the German position in North Africa. Finally, in late February 1943, Rommel, reinforced, set up a new defensive line 100 miles inside Tunisia and turned to attack Montgomery's advancing forces. But Montgomery had been forewarned by the Enigma codebreakers, and his troops were waiting as the German tanks rolled forward. British artillery broke up the assault, and the panzers were quickly halted. It was Rommel's last battle in North Africa. He now returned to Germany to beg Hitler to abandon the North African campaign. But Hitler refused. It was a misjudgment. As Montgomery's 8th Army now pushed up from the south, the Anglo-American First Army squeezed in from the west. On May the 7th, US forces took the port of Bizerta. The British 7th Armoured Division, the famous Desert Rats, drove into Tunis. The Allies' pincer closed, and the Axis troops were trapped. 5 days later, 250,000 German and Italian soldiers surrendered. It was more than twice the number that had surrendered at Stalingrad 4 months earlier. For Germany, it was another momentous disaster. The following day, the British Regional Commander-in-Chief, General Harold Alexander, signalled Winston Churchill, "Sir, it is my duty to report that all enemy resistance has ceased. We are the masters of the North African shores." Mussolini's gamble in North Africa had taken a terrible toll on German resources. It was about to have even more serious consequences for both him and Germany. In January 1943, at a conference in the Moroccan city of Casablanca, Churchill and Roosevelt agreed to open a new front on German-dominated Europe. The obvious target was Italy, seriously weakened by its North African failures. The only question was, where should the invasion begin? Should the route go via Sardinia or Sicily? The Allied High Command chose the Sicilian route, but to throw the Germans off the scent, they organized a deception plan. Operation Mincemeat was launched. A corpse was dropped off the shores of Spain carrying false papers. When it was washed ashore in May 1943 and the papers passed to the Germans, they revealed that the Allies would pretend to attack Sicily, but that their real target was Sardinia. Enigma code breakers soon confirmed the Germans had fallen for it. Six weeks later, the British 8th Army, under Montgomery, landed in the southeast corner of Sicily. The Italian coastal troops presented few problems. Further west, the US 7th Army landed in the Gulf of Gela. The Italian resistance was again overwhelmed. For the Italian people, the invasion of Sicily was the final humiliation. Mussolini was overthrown in a popular uprising. The new government now opened secret talks with the Allies for an armistice. For Hitler, it was another nightmare. He was now forced to pour in yet more scarce resources to protect his southern flank. He told his commanders that even if Italy surrendered, they should fight on. Within 5 weeks, the Germans had been pushed out of Sicily. The Allies now crossed to the mainland and pushed up through the country. US troops moved up the west side. British troops moved up the east. The Germans fought back savagely all the way. Even so, Naples fell to the Allies on October the 1st, 1943. But then their progress was slowed by autumn rains and skillful German rearguard attacks. It was not until the end of November that Allied forces finally reached the Gustav Line, the first of a series of German defensive positions cutting across Italy. British troops managed to break through at the eastern end of the line, but winter was setting in, and bad weather forced them to halt. Nevertheless, in the west, US forces attempted to outflank the German defences by taking to the sea. They landed on January the 22nd, 1944, 60 miles to the north at the point of Anzio. But here, amidst fierce fighting, they were pinned down and nearly driven back into the sea. The Americans remained trapped at Anzio for the rest of the winter and into the spring. Meanwhile, in the center of Italy, the key to breaking the Gustav Line was the towering Monte Cassino mountain complex. As spring came, there was a series of attempts to capture it. Each assault failed. In desperation, the Allies bombed the historic monastery on the summit. But the Germans hung on. Finally, in late spring 1944, as the weather improved, the Allied forces broke through the German lines. Simultaneously, the Americans broke out of Anzio. The Allied forces now moved swiftly north to Rome. The Italian capital was liberated on June the 4th, 1944. For Hitler, it was another blow. He was now hanging on to Italy by his fingernails. The Allies continued to push north. The German defenders finally fell back to the formidable Gothic line, just north of Florence. Here, bad weather again brought the Allied advance to a halt. It wouldn't be until the spring of 1945 that the campaign could resume and Italy was finally won. By then, the Italians had had enough of Mussolini. He was captured by Italian partisan forces and shot. His corpse was hung by its heels in Milan. Mussolini's war had been a catastrophe for himself and his country. It had also left the German southern flank dangerously exposed. The German army was now overcommitted, short of troops, and retreating on all fronts.